Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We are starting today with a question that has tripped up practically every English speaker, writer, and editor since, I don't know, the internet was invented.
It really has. It's one of those universal pain points.
Yeah, exactly. If you've ever hesitated while writing an email, or you stopped mid-sentence wondering, wait, is it learned or learnt? Or maybe, did the boat dived into the water, or did it dove? You are tapping into this huge linguistic confusion.
And that's the thing. That uncertainty, it isn't a sign of poor grammar. It's actually a symptom of English being this living, breathing, constantly evolving language.
Right. It's not that you're wrong, it's that the language is moving under your feet.
That confusion sits right at the heart of this constant negotiation between consistency and tradition.
Right.
You know, we have hundreds of verbs in English, and we often see these dual past tense forms.
And both can be correct.
Yeah. In many cases, yes, both are technically correct. But their usage signals something really crucial about your context, whether you're using a British dialect, an American one, or maybe you're just reflecting how pop culture or, sports commentary has kind of overwritten the formal rules.
Okay, so let's unpack this entire mess. Our mission today is, I think, satisfyingly specific. We're going to tackle 15 common verbs that cause this exact split. This deep dive is designed to be your definitive shortcut to understanding the mechanics behind the choice. We'll be separating the clear dialectal splits, where both forms are basically fine, BRE versus AME, from the real grammatical battles.
Right. The ones where popular usage, a catchy movie title, or a sports broadcaster actively created a form that's technically incorrect but is now, well, it's widely accepted.
So we're framing this around two core ideas.
Exactly. Consistency and context. The big picture, really, is that the primary split, which covers about 2/3 of our list, comes down to British English. It tends to favor older, shorter, slightly irregular forms ending in a T. Meanwhile, American English strongly pushes for standardization, using that regular "ed" ending.
And why should you, our listener, care about this?
Well, because it helps you select your linguistic toolkit with power and precision. This isn't just about avoiding errors. It's about understanding the sociological drivers of language change.
Exactly. This is about language authority.
Yeah.
When does the dictionary decide, and when does the consensus of millions of people watching a blockbuster movie decide?
A great question.
You need to know the rules, not just so you can follow them, but so you understand the implications when you choose to deviate. So let's start with section 1, where things are relatively orderly.
Relatively.
The great dialect divide the T versus ED rule. This structure is, I think, foundational to understanding why these specific verbs confuse us all so much.
It really is. And the linguistic principle at play here is called regularization. English, at its roots, is a Germanic language, so it started with many irregular verbs, often with a vowel shift in the past tense, like sing becomes sang. Over centuries, speakers naturally sought efficiency. They pushed verbs toward that predictable, easy ed ending. British English, being, geographically and historically closer to those linguistic roots, often acts as the holdout. It preserves the older, slightly irregular EST forms.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. It's tradition versus efficiency. Let's dive right into the first 3 verbs that perfectly illustrate this standard TED pattern.
The first one is to burn, so meaning to destroy or damage by fire or heat.
Okay, and in British English, the overwhelming preference is for the past tense form, burnt, B-U-R-N-T.
Whereas in American English, it's almost exclusively the regularized form, burn, B-U-R-N-E-D. The linguistic sources we looked at confirm that this split is one of the most stable dialectal differences out there.
There's always a but, isn't there?
There's always a but. The caveat, especially in modern global communication, is overlap. Because of the vast consumption of media across the Atlantic UK audiences watching US shows and vice versa, you are increasingly likely to hear burned in London or see burnt in New York.
That overlap doesn't make the choice arbitrary, though. It actually highlights the formality of the context. If I'm writing a formal paper for a British university, I should instinctively reach for burnt. But if I'm writing a feature for an American magazine, I'm using burned. The usage note is crucial. If you say, she burnt her hand on the kettle, that tent ending immediately signals that subtle historic preservation found in British English.
Yeah.
If you use burned, you're siding with the modern drive toward predictable consistency.
And that drive toward consistency is what often makes learning these forms challenging for non-native speakers. They initially learn one form, usually the regular ed, only to then encounter the irregular it form later in, say, classical literature or British media.
Right. Okay, our second example follows this exact rhythm. To dream, which means to experience whilst asleep.
And the forms are dreamt for British English versus dreamed for American English. And again, both are absolutely correct. It just depends entirely on your dialectal environment.
Now, here's where we get into the really cool technical detail.
Mm.
The British English form, dreamt, is surprisingly difficult for many speakers to pronounce smoothly.
Yeah, the phonetics here are fascinating. When you pronounce dreamt, you're making a really complicated jump from the voiced consonant sound, the M, which involves your vocal cords vibrating, directly into the unvoiced sharp T sound, where there's no vibration. Duh!
That transition it's awkward for the mouth. If you listen closely, sometimes speakers, in an effort to bridge that gap quickly, they kind of insert a plosive sound. It almost sounds like dreamt with an unwanted T.
Exactly. And that's something to be actively resisted if you want to use the British form correctly. It should be a smooth shift from M to T. The American form, dream, just rolls off the tongue. It completely avoids this phonetic challenge, which is one reason regularization tends to win out over time. It's just easier.
It is easier. And finally, the undisputed champion of past tense confusion. To learn. To gain knowledge by studying, being taught, or through experience.
Ah, yes, the big one.
If you've ever searched for an answer to this linguistic question, this is probably the verb you were searching for. Is it learned or learnt?
And the answer is learnt, L-E-A-R-N-T, is the British English form, and learned, L-E-A-R-N-E-D, is the American English form. And this example carries extra weight because the past participle form, learned, can also function as an adjective.
Ah, that's a key distinction. When we use it as an adjective meaning knowledgeable or educated, we always use the ed form, and it's pronounced differently, right? It's learned.
Precisely. She is a very learned scholar. 2 syllables. In that usage, it's not functioning as the past tense of the verb to learn. It's a descriptive adjective.
I see.
However, when you're using it as the simple past tense, both learnt and learned are correct, and they just reflect that global dialectal split.
So if I say, I learned a lot in English class yesterday, I'm using the American English simple past tense. If I say, I learned a lot, I'm using the British English one. The prevalence of this verb in education, business, and just daily life explains why it causes such a high level of cross-cultural anxiety. Understanding that the two forms simply signal location, not grammatical superiority, is immediately freeing for you as a speaker.
And once you recognize this clear BRE-T versus AME pattern, you gain immediate clarity over our next grouping, which we've dubbed the similar-sounding quartet.
Let's do it. Let's move on to these 4 verbs that share this pattern but also share a subtle spelling oddity in their T forms. Smell, spell, spill, and spoil.
Starting with to smell, which can be, the sensation itself or the ability to recognize that sensation.
The forms are smelt, BRE, versus smelled, AME. And the fascinating detail here, which applies to the whole quartet, is that the British form, smelt, loses an L. The base verb has 2 L's, S-M-E-L-L, but the past tense is S-M-E-L-T.
Yeah, this is a subtle but pretty common orthographic shift. When English forms the past tense with that T, especially after a short vowel sound, it often simplifies the spelling of the root word, dropping the second consonant before adding the T. It's sort of related to minimizing the complexity of the spelling when the pronunciation is already shortened.
Let's ground that with an example. If I were narrating a scene in a novel, I could write, "She smelt of cinnamon and cloves." Or, if I were using the American style, "She smelled of cinnamon and cloves." Both create that sensory detail, but the word choice carries that dialectal flag.
And now you can connect that pattern immediately to spell, meaning to say or write the letters of a word in the correct order.
And we find the exact same rule. Spelt, BRE, losing the second L, versus spelled, AME. The consistency across this quartet really helps solidify the learning.
Yeah, and the example here is highly relevant to our conversation. My surname is spelt, or spelled C-L-A-R-K-E. It's an interesting moment of self-reference where the very act of spelling requires you to use one of these dual past tense verbs.
I like that. Okay, next is to spill. To flow over the edge of a container by accident.
The forms here are spilt for British English and spilled for American English. Once more, the T form, spilt, is slightly irregular in its ending.
Think about the imagery. Water had spilled out of the bucket onto the freshly waxed floor. That quick, short, decisive sound of spilt. It almost mirrors the suddenness of the action better than the elongated spilled.
That's a great point. It's speculation, of course, but the brevity of the British form often gives it a certain immediacy.
Yeah. And wrapping up this quartet is to spoil. This is the verb we use when something good is changed into something bad or useless.
We've spoiled in British English versus spoiled in American English. This one is really common in parenting discussions, too.
Oh, absolutely. He completely spoiled the ending of the movie. Or, in the context of children, the child was completely spoiled by his grandmother's constant gifts.
And the choice remains purely one of geography, not grammar, as long as you remain consistent. If you're reading Dickens, you should expect spoiled. If you're watching a modern Netflix series produced in LA, you should expect spoiled.
That distinction, just recognizing that the choice is contextual, that's the entire takeaway from this first block of verbs. You aren't making a mistake, you're just opting into a particular linguistic heritage.
Right. So now let's look at a trio of verbs related to movement: kneel, lean, and leap. These verbs, while they adhere to the TED split, often show a greater acceptance of the irregular T forms, even among American speakers.
Okay, let's start with to kneel, which is to move or be supported by a knee or knees.
The British English irregular form is knelt, K-N-E-L-T. The American English regular form is kneeled, K-N-E-L-E-D.
My sense, though, is that knelt is far more common globally, even in American English, than perhaps learnt is. It has a high survival rate. Why do you think that is? Does kneel just feel clunky?
It does, and that's a key observation. Many of these older irregular forms, particularly those describing quick physical actions, have a shorter syllable structure. Knelt is one syllable, kneeled is two. So for a quick, decisive action like dropping down on one knee, the one-syllable form is often preferred for efficiency, and that temporarily arrests the forces of regularization.
Right, the famous example. When he knelt or kneeled down on one knee to ask her to marry him, he felt incredibly nervous. When you're narrating that high-stakes moment, knelt just provides a quicker narrative punch.
It does. Next up is to lean. This describes two common actions: either resting on or against something for support, or bending or moving from a vertical position.
And the British English past tense is lent, L-E-N-T. The American English form is leaned, L-E-A-N-E-D. And you have to note that lent is pronounced the same way as the past tense of the verb to lend, as in to give temporarily.
Right, but that potential for confusion doesn't stop the usage. What's important here, as the source material pointed out, is that either form lent or leaned can be applied to both definitions of the verb.
So the meaning doesn't dictate the past tense. I can say, the man leant on the wall for support, using the BRE form, or the woman leaned out of the window to get a better view, using the AME form for the bending definition. The choice remains entirely dialectal.
Correct. And finally, in this movement trio, we have to leap, which is to jump high or a long way.
The familiar story repeats itself. British English gives us leapt, L-E-A-A-P, and American English usually gives us leaped, L-E-A-P-E-D.
And think of this verb in, nature documentaries or poetry. The dolphin leapt out of the water in a majestic arc. The T ending here, leapt, again feels faster, maybe more visceral, which reinforces why these irregular forms persist in certain stylistic contexts, even when regularization is available.
Okay, so to synthesize section 1, we've covered 10 verbs: burn, dream, learn, smell, spell, spoil, kneel, lean, and leap, all governed by this clear BRE versus AME rule. If you choose the AME form, you're choosing an older, often irregular structure. If you choose the AVR, you're choosing simplification and regularity. The key insight is that both are correct.
And for you, the listener, this means that anxiety should just disappear. You now know the mechanism. You select your audience or your style guide, and you can proceed confidently.
Okay, that wraps up the clear-cut dialectal divide. Now we shift the conversation, and this is where the power dynamics of language get really interesting.
Yes.
We are moving from cases where both forms were mostly correct to cases where popular mass media usage is actively fighting, challenging, or just plain overriding officially correct grammar. This is where culture dictates the rulebook.
This transition brings us to the most dynamic part of this deep dive. We're looking at the forces of analogy, jargon, and pop culture that drive language change from the bottom up. They often create forms that prescriptive grammarians immediately reject, yet they become unavoidable in common speech.
Let's start with two verbs driven by analogy and specific phrasal uses: creep and dive.
Beginning with to creep, which means to move slowly, body close to the ground, or to move stealthily. The officially correct past tense, following the pattern of verbs like sleep, slept, and keep, kept, is crept. C-R-E-P-T.
But the growing non-standard past tense we hear constantly, particularly in American English, is creeped. And this error didn't just happen randomly, it kind of creeped into the language because of a very specific and perfectly correct usage of the verb.
Exactly. The reason is the common phrasal verb, to creep out, meaning to make someone feel nervous or uneasy. When you use this phrasal verb, the past tense must always be creeped out. For instance, I was so creeped out by the silence. That usage is inviolable.
Ah, okay. So because that combination, creeped out, is structurally and grammatically sound for the phrasal verb, the human brain, which is always looking for shortcuts, started mistakenly applying creeped to the simple past tense of the verb to creep all by itself.
But let's use a couple of examples to really nail this difference down for the listener, because this is where the confusion lives.
Okay. Example 1. She crept along the corridor, moving slowly. That's the correct simple past for movement.
Right. Example 2, that shadow creeped out the babysitter. That's the correct past tense for the phrasal verb, meaning to make someone uneasy.
And example 3, the mistake. The cat creeped up on the mouse. That's incorrect, it should be.
Yeah.
The cat crept up on the mouse.
And crucially, notice that you can only be creeped out. You cannot be crept out. That phrase just doesn't exist in English. The correct usage of the phrasal verb is so pervasive that it has infected the simple past tense, making creeped for simple movement a highly common, though still technically incorrect form.
It's a clear demonstration of how context bleeds into general linguistic rules. Okay, moving to the second example in this section, to dive. The definition is to jump into water head first. Officially, the correct past tense is dived.
However, the non-standard form dove, D-O-A-V-E, is incredibly popular, especially across North America, leading to a constant debate among language authorities.
Right, and this brings up that question. When does a mistake stop being a mistake and just become the norm? Dove is the perfect test case for this.
It is. The analogy theory here is extremely compelling. This shift is thought to be driven by the verb to drive. The past tense of drive is drove. The pattern is the I changing to an O.
So the pattern drive drove is being mistakenly applied by speakers to dive, which results in dove.
Exactly. And the reason this analogy holds such power is that drives became a high-frequency verb about a century ago with the widespread adoption of the automobile. That drive-drove pattern became ubiquitous in the linguistic environment. It was so constant that the brain naturally began applying it to similar-sounding verbs like dive.
So it's a case of a younger, high-frequency, irregular verb structure basically imposing itself on an older, regular verb.
That's a great way to put it.
If I'm writing a formal report on marine biology, I'm probably going to stick with dived. But if I'm just chatting with friends about a weekend at the lake, dove sounds completely natural.
And that distinction highlights that dived is the officially correct path, but dove is the winning form in terms of modern usage frequency, at least in American English.
Okay, let's pivot now to verbs driven by a specialist context, starting with to grind. This means to break or crush into small pieces, or, metaphorically, to work hard and steadily.
The officially correct past tense for this irregular verb is ground, G-R-O-U-N-D. So if I'm in the kitchen, I say, I ground the chili seeds into a fine powder.
But the incorrect form, grinded, G-R-I-N-D-E-D, is rapidly gaining ground, no pun intended. And its entry point into mainstream English is almost exclusively through American sports commentary.
It is. This is a spectacular example of how jargon from a high-visibility cultural platform can just overwrite the general rules.
So what's the context in sports? What does it mean?
The phrase is typically to grind out a victory. It means to win through sheer, sustained effort, often overcoming physical resistance or a better opponent. When a commentator says the defense grinded out a 10-0 victory in the mud, grinded feels precise and descriptive within that jargon context.
I see. In the sports world, grinded implies the effort was sustained and painful. It was a process. If they said they ground out a victory, it feels more like a finished product, like ground coffee. Grinded suggests the ongoing struggle.
Precisely. The nuance of the sports jargon has created an exception that is now accepted in that world.
And because millions of people consume sports commentary daily, that acceptable error bleeds into out-of-context use. So now we hear people incorrectly say, I grinded through my college dissertation.
When they should have used the official past tense, I ground through my dissertation. The context of physical labor has moved the grammatical goalposts.
A similar battle between technical correctness and specialized usage is happening with to plead. This verb has two core definitions. One, to ask strongly or seriously, and two, to state guilt or innocence in court.
And the officially correct past tense is and remains pleaded, P-L-E-A-D-E-D.
However, the non-standard form, pled, P-L-E, is becoming widely accepted, but almost exclusively when referring to the legal definition.
This is another case where the environment dictates the linguistic choice. Courtrooms, legal documents, news reports covering trials, they all require immediate clarity and often brevity. Pled is shorter, faster, and it maybe feels more decisive.
It's interesting that the very people, judges, lawyers, journalists, who rely on precise language are the ones pushing the non-standard form. Why do you think grammar lovers often reject pled so forcefully?
Well, because it often sounds archaic or just irregular in a way that doesn't fit a clear pattern, unlike burnt or dreamt. It's a bit of a linguistic orphan, but its acceptance in legal speech shows that function often outweighs formality. He pled insanity in court, versus the formally correct, he pleaded insanity. For a quick news headline, pled is undeniably more efficient.
But if I'm writing up the non-legal definition, the emotional one, I should stick to the official form, right?
Right.
She pleaded with her mother for 5 extra minutes of screen time. Pled just doesn't feel right there at all.
That's the key takeaway. If you are going to use pled, restrict its usage strictly to the legal context where it has gained this quasi-official status. In all other scenarios, pleaded is the correct and safest choice.
Okay, we've covered analogy, phrasal verbs, sports commentary, and legal context. Now we come to what I like to call the pop culture grammar crime, and this one is infamous: to shrink.
Ah, yes. This verb, meaning to become or make something smaller, is an irregular verb. And that means it's 3 forms. The base form, V1, the simple past, V2, and the past participle, V3, should all be distinct.
Okay, to make sure the listener is crystal clear, let's quickly use a common, stable, irregular verb to set the structure.
Let's use to sing. V1, the base form, is sing. V2, the simple past, is sung. V3, the past participle, is sung. That structure, V1, V2, V3, is consistent for all strong irregular verbs.
Okay, now let's apply that perfect structure to our problem child. To shrink. V1, base, shrink. V2, simple past, shrank. And V3, past participle, shrunk.
And the grammatical error occurs when people substitute the V3 form, shrunk, for the correct V2, shrank, in the simple past tense. For example, instead of saying the shirt shrank in the wash, they say the shirt shrunk in the wash.
And the single culprit responsible for cementing this error in common usage is a massive box office success. The movie title, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids.
The power of that phrase is just undeniable. Let's dissect the title itself. If the filmmakers intended to use the simple past tense, V2, the title should have been, Honey, I Shrank the Kids.
Okay. And if they intended to use the present perfect construction, which uses the V3 form, meaning the action started in the past but has relevance now, it should have been what?
It should have been, Honey, I have shrunk the kids, or contracted, Honey, I've shrunk the kids.
I see.
By using shrunk without the preceding auxiliary verb like have or had, the movie title is, strictly speaking, grammatically incorrect. It's using the past participle, V3, as the simple past tense, V2.
But the title was so catchy, so memorable, and seen by so many millions globally that it just solidified the incorrect usage in common speech. The collective weight of pop culture consumption completely trumped the rulebook.
And this is the most profound lesson of this deep dive. Grammar is only as fixed as its cultural application allows it to be. When faced with a choice between the technical rule and the rhythm of a beloved, globally recognized phrase, people will often choose the latter.
So if you want to be precise, you have to intentionally fight the urge created by the movie title and say, the sweater shrank. But knowing that most people will use shrunk for the simple past means you understand why that error exists.
Exactly. You now have the power to code switch. You use shrank in your thesis, and you can tolerate shrunk in casual conversation. You know the underlying conflict.
Okay, let's bring it all back together and synthesize these 15 verbs. We started by drawing a very clear line in the sand between 2 types of confusion.
The first and largest category, burn, dream, learn, smell, spell, spoil, kneel, lean, and leap, was governed by the great dialect divide. This is a competition between the British English preference for the older, irregular AT ending
and the American English linguistic impulse towards simplification and regularization with the ed ending. In these cases, there is no error. There's only choice based on dialect. And the second, smaller but culturally far more volatile category, creep, dive, grind, plead, and shrink, showed us where usage actively fights the formal grammar rules.
Yeah, we saw how linguistic mechanics, analogy, and specialized context can hijack a verb. The correct use of the phrasal verb creeped out drove the non-standard simple past creeped. The high frequency of drive drove created the analogy for dove.
Sports jargon popularized grinded. The brevity needed in legal proceedings pushed pled into acceptance, and of course the cultural gravity of a movie title solidified the incorrect use of shrunk for the symbol past.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We've seen that the biggest authority on language is sometimes the dictionary, but often it's simply the collective habits of millions of speakers.
And for that reason, the single most important rule you can take away from this entire deep dive is consistency is queen.
That means regardless of whether you choose the British burned or the American burned, or even if you decide to side with the widely accepted error of, the crucial thing is to maintain that choice within your own communication.
Don't mix and match.
Right. Avoid mixing and matching forms. Don't write 3 pages using the BRE style and then suddenly drop in learn and spilled on the 4th. Choose your lane and stick to it. Show intention and control over your language.
This deep dive really reinforces that grammar is not a static rule book dictated by dusty old dictionaries. It is a negotiation constantly influenced by high-visibility cultural platforms. Language authority is decentralized.
Yeah, and that raises an important and provocative question for you to mull over the next time you hear a strange past tense form. We've seen movies, sports, and legal systems change the rules. If the language of technology and social media is the fastest growing linguistic environment today,
Which it is.
what other common verbs, perhaps verbs related to computing or online interaction, are currently being shaped or incorrectly warped by trending phrases or platform jargon that we haven't even registered yet?
That's a great question. Pay attention to the past tense of verbs like to like or to stream. Are we starting to see non-standard past tense forms emerge that sound slightly more visceral or efficient in the context of the platform? The grammatical fight is never truly over.
Something to think about as you go back to your emails and confidently decide whether you spelt or spelled that word correctly. You now have the knowledge to make that choice based on context, not confusion. Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.